In this video, I want to give you some tips for sufficient assumption questions that involve arguments where there is a missing link somewhere in the logic of the argument. And by missing link, what I mean is these are arguments where the author shifts from one concept to another concept without making the connection between the two explicit. There was something inappropriate about jumping from one concept to the other, and that's the problem with the argument. This structure is very common on sufficient assumption questions, but it's also found in many other question types. So one of the keys to excelling in logical reasoning is getting used to identifying missing links, but more importantly, the direction of the missing link. You see, what will often happen is students can tell that the argument is shifting between two concepts, that there's a jump from one idea to another idea. But many times students will not be confident about whether the direction that we need is concept A leads to concept B, or whether what we actually need is concept B leads to concept A. And that's the bulk of what I want to go into in this video. How do you actually tell what's the right direction? What you'll find is there is something relatively straightforward that we can do to help us be confident about the right direction. Now, before we get into the actual meat of this video, I want to cover some general points about sufficient assumption questions just to make sure that we're on the same page as far as when the advice I'm giving you in this video is appropriate. I want to make sure you understand the proper scope of what we're covering in this video, because I've found that oftentimes students have some misconceptions about sufficient assumption questions. What I mean is this. When I ask a student what is the criteria for the correct answer on a sufficient assumption question, or when I ask how should we approach sufficient assumption questions, very often what someone will say is we should diagram and look for something that completes the diagram. Or they might say something like, we should try to bridge the gap between the premise and the conclusion. I mean, that's the kind of language that is commonly used when students talk about sufficient assumption questions. But I want to make clear that fundamentally the criteria for the right answer is we are looking for something that, if true, in connection with the other premises, will prove the conclusion. Which answer, if you add it to the argument, is going to force us to accept the conclusion. Now, the reason that a lot of people talk about this problem type in terms of diagrams or missing links or bridging the gap, filling the gap, the reason that kind of language is used is because very commonly the problem in the argument in a sufficient assumption question is that the author is jumping from one concept to another concept. And so if you can see that, then your goal is to then fill the gap between those two concepts. So that's commonly what's happening, but that's not the only kind of argument structure that can appear on sufficient assumption problems. You might have a flaw that is more numbers based, that's based on percentage and amount issues. You could have other kinds of flaws out there. And so when you're doing a sufficient assumption question, don't go into it thinking that you have to diagram or that it's going to be one of those questions where you're trying to connect the dots between two different concepts. That may be very commonly what is going to happen in the argument, but that's not the strategy for sufficient assumption questions. You got to take what the argument gives you. If the argument gives you something where it's about connecting the dots between two different concepts, then that's great. But if the argument is not of that structure, then you shouldn't be approaching it in that way. And the advice that I'm giving you in this video will not necessarily apply to those other kinds of argument structures, all right? So we're just talking about arguments where you have identified the problem is that the argument is shifting from one concept to another concept. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at what do I mean by missing link. How do we identify the correct direction of the link? And then we'll finish with some ways that the LSAT will, of course, complicate things. I want to start with what should be a very easy, straightforward example, just to show you intuitively, you probably understand what a missing link is. When you read this, and it says the premise is the writer's latest novel is critically acclaimed. The conclusion is, thus it is worth reading. When you read this argument, what comes to mind when I ask what the argument is assuming? You're probably thinking they're assuming that something that's critically acclaimed is worth reading. And yeah, I mean, that is what the assumption is. If we were doing a sufficient assumption question, the right answer is either going to say, if something is critically acclaimed, then it's worth reading, or it might be phrased in the form of the contrapositive, if something is not worth reading, then it is not critically acclaimed. So this one is probably going to be pretty intuitive. But take a look at this next argument. The property value of our home will drop if the weather reports are wrong. So the property value of our home will drop if the hurricane causes significant damage to our neighborhood. What would you say this argument is assuming? Now, a lot of times people will say, I can recognize that there's some jump from the weather reports being wrong and the hurricane causing significant damage to our neighborhood. I know the author is assuming some kind of connection between those two ideas. But sometimes the LSAT will require us to be more precise than just having the vague understanding that these two ideas are connected. We will need to know, is the connection that this argument is assuming, is it if the weather reports are wrong, then the hurricane will cause significant damage to the neighborhood? Or is it the other way around? Is it if the hurricane causes significant damage to the neighborhood, then the weather reports are wrong? Now, the correct answer is the second one. And if you thought the correct answer was the first one, or were unconfident and hesitant and not really sure about which one was the right direction, this is the reason that I'm making the video, because there's actually a very easy, well, I don't want to say easy, but a relatively straightforward way to guarantee that you will understand the right direction. Now I'm cutting directly to how you tell what the direction of the missing link is, and then we'll go back to that previous example to see how it works in action. All right, so compare these two arguments side by side. Now here I'm assuming you have familiarity with conditional logic. Here the first premise is, if K is true, then Y is true. The conclusion is, therefore, if K is true, then F is true. What is the missing link in this argument? Is it if Y, then F, or is it if F, then Y? Well, the answer is if Y, then F. And how do you know? How does one know that that is actually the answer? Why isn't it the other way around? Well, can you think about what would happen if it were the other way around? If F, then Y? Does adding that to this argument prove that every single K is an F? Well, all this would show is I know that K's are Y, I know that F's are Y, but the problem is the Y circle could be this big one here, and maybe this one is the K circle and this one is the F circle. This does not show that every single K is going to fall into the category of F. So that's why F going to Y isn't going to be the answer. The answer is instead going to be Y going to F. Now let's compare that to the argument on the right here. If we have a premise that says if K is true, then Y is true. Therefore, if Q is true, Y is true. What's the correct direction of the link that we want? Is it if K then Q, or is it if Q then K? Well, the correct answer is if Q then K. Now let's think about why. Why isn't it the other way around? Well, if we have if K then Q, is that going to help prove that every single K, or rather that every single Q, is a Y? Well, no, the problem is I know all K's are Y. I know all K's are Q. So if you're thinking of this in terms of sets and subsets, every single K is a Y. I also know every single K is a Q, but do you notice that there could be plenty of Q's here that are not Y's? So that's why this direction here is not going to prove our conclusion. The correct answer is going to be if Q, then K, because this would allow me to say all Q's are K, and if I know all K's are Y, that allows me to connect from Q to Y. Now this explanation that we ran through is pretty long, not something you want to keep having to recite to yourself whenever you're encountering these basic arguments. So is there a quicker way to identify what the correct direction is? And yes, there is. Pay attention to where the new concept is in the conclusion. So what I mean by that is, remember, under the initial argument on the left here, and I'll go ahead and erase both assumptions. On the initial argument on the left here, what is the new concept that appears in the conclusion? Well, it's F, right? So that tells you that the argument must be assuming something about F. There's something that connects to F. Here's the critical question. Which side of the arrow does F appear on? Or in other words, is F the sufficient condition or the necessary condition? It's the necessary condition. And that means the assumption has to put F on the necessary condition as well. It also has to be on the right side if F was in the right side in the conclusion. Wherever the new concept appears in the conclusion, whether it's a sufficient condition or a necessary condition, that's where it has to appear in the assumption as well. So that's how you can tell in this argument what we're looking for is the Y is going to lead to F. It wouldn't work if it were the other way around. If you had an assumption that put the new concept F on the left side, that is never going to prove that K leads to F. Because all that assumption is telling me is if we start off with F, that leads to something else. But I'm trying to prove that something leads to F. I'm not trying to prove what F leads to. So that's why the correct answer on the argument on the left here for a sufficient assumption problem cannot have F on the sufficient side on the left side of the arrow. It has to put the F on the right side of the arrow. And so now when we look at the argument on the right here, let me ask the question, what side does a new concept Q appear on in the conclusion? Well, it's the sufficient condition side, the left side of the arrow. And if you recognize that, that means the right answer needs to have Q on the left side of the assumption. You know the answer is going to look something like this. If Q, then something else. And in this case, that thing would be the thing that leads to Y. Since we're trying to prove that Q leads to Y, I already know K leads to Y. So what I want to do is I want to go from Q to K. Now, why isn't it the other way around? How come it's not going to be K goes to Q? Why isn't the answer ever going to have Q on the right side like that? Well, because I'm trying to prove that all Q's are Y. I'm trying to prove that if you start with Q, that's going to lead somewhere else. And I currently don't have any other information about Q in the premise. So if I add another premise that tells me what leads to Q, that's not going to prove what happens if I already start off with Q. I'm trying to prove what happens if you already start off with Q. I'm not trying to prove what leads to Q. So that's how you can be certain in this case that the answer is not going to have Q on the right side of the arrow. It's going to be on the left side of the arrow. So the takeaway right now is that if you are faced with an argument where there is a new concept in the conclusion, and remember by new concept, I mean a concept that was not mentioned or logically covered in the premises, if you're faced with that kind of argument, you know that the argument is assuming something about that new concept. Something about the premise is going to connect with that new concept. And the direction of the connection just depends on which side of the arrow that new concept is on. Or if you don't want to think of it in terms of an arrow, it's going to depend on whether that new concept is the sufficient condition, the if, or whether it is the necessary condition, the thing that's required. If the new concept is the if is on the sufficient condition, then that means the assumption will also have the new concept as a sufficient condition. And if the new concept is in the necessary condition side of the conclusion, then the correct answer, the assumption, will have that new concept in the necessary side as well. Now, one thing, of course, you'll have to keep in mind is that you could also have the contrapositive of those forms. So when I say that, for example, the Q has to be on the left side here in the assumption, that also means the answer could look like this. Something leads to not Q. And when it comes to the argument on the left, when I was saying that the correct answer has to have F on the right side of the arrow because the new concept F was also on the right side of the arrow in the conclusion, well, of course, the answer could also look like the contrapositive. It could say, if not F, then something else. So the contrapositive, of course, is just something you'll always have to keep in mind. So now let's apply what we just learned to that previous example before we move on to some new examples. The premise here is the property value of our home will drop if the weather reports are wrong. So if is the sufficient condition, the left side of the arrow. Here's the premise. If the weather reports are wrong, then the property value of our home will drop. And the conclusion is, so the property value of our home will drop if, so here the if is the sufficient condition, if the hurricane causes significant damage to our neighborhood. So I'll just do if damage, then property value of our home will drop. So that's the same concept that we had over there, drop. And now what's the new concept in the conclusion, if there is one? Well, the new concept is the idea of hurricane causing damage, right? That didn't appear in the premise. So what side is that concept on? It's on the left side. So that means the assumption is going to look like this. It's going to say if the hurricane causes significant damage, then something else. And what is that something else going to be? Well, I know that if the weather reports are wrong, that will lead to the value of the home dropping. And so if I want to show that the damage, hurricane causing damage, will lead to the value of the home dropping, I want damage to lead into wrong. If I can say that hurricane causing damage would mean that the weather report is wrong, that would mean the weather report being wrong goes to drop, and now we have a valid conclusion. Go ahead and try this example on your own. We know that all professional boxers enjoy solving jigsaw puzzles, since they all enjoy reading mystery novels. So what's the missing piece here? Is it if someone enjoys jigsaw puzzles, then they enjoy mystery novels? Or is it if they enjoy mystery novels, then they enjoy jigsaw puzzles? Well, let's figure it out. First of all, the premise is going to be the since part, right? So hopefully you didn't get fooled by the conclusion being in the front here. All the other examples were neatly laid out. The conclusion was the second statement. Now it's the first statement. But that doesn't change anything about the underlying logic of how we approach things. So the premise is they all enjoy reading mystery novels. If you wanted to diagram that, which you don't have to, but you could, right? The all, who's that referring to? It's referring to professional boxers. So you could think of that as if professional boxer then enjoys reading mystery novels, and I'll use MN. What's the conclusion? All professional boxers enjoy solving jigsaw puzzles. So if PB, then enjoy solving jigsaw puzzles. What's the new concept in the conclusion if there is one? Well, it's the jigsaw puzzle. I don't have any premise that tells me about solving jigsaw puzzles. Which side of the conclusion is jigsaw puzzles on? It's on the right side. So that's telling me the assumption is going to look like this. It's going to have JP on the right side. Now, what do I want to lead into JP? Well, I'm trying to prove that the professional boxers lead to JP. I know that professional boxers lead to MN. So if I can just get from MN to JP, that's going to do it for me. If I can go from MN to JP, now we have a valid argument. PB would go to JP. Let's go ahead and try one more example before we turn to a different topic. So here we have all professional boxers enjoy reading mystery novels. Hence, everyone attending the opera tonight enjoys reading mystery novels. So what's the missing link here? Is it if you are a professional boxer, then you are attending the opera tonight? Or is it if you are attending the opera tonight, then you are a professional boxer? Well, let's figure it out. So the premise here is the first sentence because the conclusion is the second one beginning with hence. So the premise is all professional boxers enjoy reading mystery novels. And the conclusion is everyone attending the opera tonight enjoys reading mystery novels. Now, by the way, here, the everyone is like the word all here. So this is introducing the sufficient condition. I'm getting a fact about everyone attending the opera tonight. So that's what makes attending the opera tonight, and I'll just write opera, as a sufficient condition. If opera, then enjoys reading mystery novels, that was MN. So is there a new concept in the conclusion? Yes, there is. It's attending the opera tonight. Which side of the conclusion is it on? That's on the left side. So that's telling me the missing piece here, the missing link, is going to have opera on the left side. What is opera going to lead to? Well, if I'm trying to prove that everyone attending the opera likes reading mystery novels, and I already know professional boxers, every single one of them likes reading mystery novels, then if I can get opera to connect to being a professional boxer, that's what's going to make this argument valid, because then opera would go to PB, PB would then go to MN. Now, in all the previous examples, we were dealing with arguments where you could think of the premise and the conclusion both as conditionals, and you were basically just trying to connect one part of the premise to one part of the conclusion. But there will be some arguments out there that don't quite break down in that way. For example, our university's football team is being disbanded, so the number of applications for our freshman class will decrease. This isn't quite the same as the previous problem because it's not like I'm getting another conclusion about the university's football team, or it's not like the premise is about the number of applications. There really isn't any overlap between the individual parts of each of these sentences. So what do we do in this situation? Well, sometimes the issue is just the argument is assuming that the entire premise here, that this statement, university's football team is being disbanded, is going to lead to or will prove the entire conclusion. The number of applications for our freshman class will decrease. In fact, every single argument can be characterized that way, where they are assuming that their premises, if true, are sufficient to prove their conclusion. So if we're doing a sufficient assumption problem here, where I'm trying to guarantee that this conclusion is true, if this is the extent of the argument, then the answer is going to say something like, if our university's football team is being disbanded, then the number of applications for our freshman class will decrease. Or it will be the contrapositive of that. It might say something like, in order to have our freshman class applications not decrease, our university football team cannot be disbanded. That might be something the correct answer would say. So I just want to make sure that you're aware that there is this kind of argument structure out there. It's not like you're always trying to connect individual pieces of a premise to an individual piece of a conclusion. Sometimes you're just trying to connect the entire premise to the entire conclusion. And in this kind of structure, by the way, the direction is always going to have the premise in the sufficient condition and the conclusion in the necessary condition. And just to use shorthand here, I'm going to use P for premise and C for conclusion. Here, P is the premise, C is the conclusion. The answer is always going to have this structure where if P is true, then C is true. Now here's another argument structure that you have to be ready for. In all the previous examples, the conclusion had a new concept, and we were looking to either connect a part of the premise to the new concept in the conclusion, or we were looking to connect the entire premise to the entire conclusion. But sometimes the conclusion actually does not have any new concepts. All of the concepts that were mentioned in the conclusion were actually brought up and logically covered in the premises. So what do you do in that situation? Let's take a look at this example. If there's another pandemic, the profits of companies that provide video conference services will dramatically increase. If the stock price of a company increases, some people become significantly wealthier. Thus, if there's another pandemic, some people will become significantly wealthier. So the conclusion is the last sentence. And one way to think about this is, well, I see this, if there is another pandemic, that's a sufficient condition. Do we have a premise that tells us what would happen if there's another pandemic? Yes, we do. It's the very first sentence. Okay. What about the other concept in the conclusion? Some people will become significantly wealthier. Is there a premise that tells me what leads to some people becoming significantly wealthier? Yes, there is. That's the second premise. So that means that the missing link is not going to be from the premise to the conclusion, because the conclusion is covered. Everything that was mentioned there is logically in the premises. The missing link then is going to be between the premises, not from the premise to the conclusion. So let's think about whether there's a missing link here that we need to add between the two premises. If we have a pandemic, the profits will dramatically increase for these companies. If the stock price increases, so there's our mismatch. They seem to be going from the concept of profits of companies dramatically increasing to then stock price increasing. And that's why they think the pandemic will ultimately lead to some people becoming significantly wealthier. So the piece that we want to add here, if it's a sufficient assumption question, is something along the lines of if the profits of a company dramatically increase, then the stock price of that company also increases. Something that would mean the same thing as that. So the point of going over this example is, again, just to emphasize the argument structures we were talking about in the beginning. Those are just some of what you will see in sufficient assumption problems, but not all of it. So now I want to talk about some of the ways that the LSAT will make things more complicated. How will they make it more difficult to identify a missing link in an argument or the correct direction of that missing link? And one of the ways that they will do this is by using different words that actually are supposed to mean the same thing. So sometimes what happens is people get just so mechanical about this, and when they start thinking about whether a concept is new, if there's something new in the conclusion that wasn't in the premise, they may even just think of it in terms of, is there any new word in the conclusion? And the problem with that is, as of course you're aware, the English language can have many different ways of expressing the same idea. So just because you see a new word in the conclusion or a new phrase in the conclusion does not mean that it is a new concept, because maybe there actually was a premise that is logically covering or is logically about that new phrase. In other words, what that means is the words might be new, the phrase might be new, but the concept is not new. All right, so let's take a look at this one. The premise says, if you manifest generosity to others, you will become more popular. So, if you offer people help without asking for anything in return, you will increase your chances of winning an election for public office. Interesting. Now, a lot of people would probably look at this and latch on to this phrase, manifest generosity to others. I mean, I see that in the premise. If you do that, you'll become more popular. But then they talk about offering people help without asking for anything in return. There seems to be a mismatch, right? Because is that manifesting generosity? Isn't the argument assuming that offering people help without asking for anything in return is manifesting generosity? So maybe that's the link that we want here. If you offer people help without asking for anything in return, then you manifest generosity to others. That's the answer, right? Well, the problem with that is, even if you added that to the argument, you're still left with the problem of how the conclusion said you'll increase your chances of winning an election for public office. All we know is that manifesting generosity means you'll become more popular, but does becoming more popular mean that you'll increase your chances of winning an election for public office? So what's actually happening here, and what the LSAT wants us to recognize, is that if you offer people help without asking for anything in return, that is an example of manifesting generosity. It's not an assumption. That is part of the definition. That is part of what it means to offer people help without asking for anything in return. We are meant to understand that that is an example of manifesting generosity, not an assumption. Those are the same concepts. So now that we have dealt with that part, we can focus on the actual jump, which is going from more popular to increasing your chances of winning an election for public office. Now here's another way that the LSAT will complicate things and make things more difficult on a sufficient assumption question. Sometimes the issue is that it's the answer choice that makes things tough. Because again, sometimes what happens is people just get a little bit too mechanical and they get too focused on looking for the exact word matches. Maybe they know the link that they want, they know the direction of the link, but they might go into the answer choices thinking that the right answer has to use particular specific words. But of course, there are many different ways to phrase the exact same idea, and sometimes the LSAT will play around with what it means for an assumption to be sufficient to prove the conclusion. They might give us an answer that is actually much broader, much stronger, and more than you actually need to prove the conclusion, but it's going to be correct on a sufficient assumption question because it's still sufficient enough to prove the conclusion, even if it's a lot broader than what is actually needed. So let's take a look at this example, and then I'm going to reveal an answer choice. So if you take performance-enhancing drugs, you will excel at the spelling bee. So if you take performance-enhancing drugs, you will increase your chances at getting admitted into a selective college. So probably you can tell by now the link that we're looking for is if you will excel at the spelling bee, then you will increase your chances at getting admitted into a selective college. If we could add something like that, that would make this argument valid. So take a look at this answer. If you perform above average in at least some word-based competition, then you will increase your chances at getting admitted to any college and to any graduate school program. So someone who is new to this test, who doesn't really understand what a sufficient assumption question is looking for, might reflexively get rid of this answer because it just seems so different from what we were actually looking for, right? Doesn't say spelling bee, and it says you're going to increase your chances at any college and any graduate school program. That's way broader than what we were talking about. We're just talking about into a selective college. But if you really understand what we were looking for in a sufficient assumption problem, then you might start to realize that this actually will do it for us. This, if we were able to add this to the argument, actually would prove this conclusion. And how does it do that? Well, the premise says if you take performance-enhancing drugs, you will excel at the spelling bee. Now, excelling at the spelling bee is going to put you into the category of performing above average in at least some word-based competition, right? That's the meaning of excelling. If you excel, then you, at the very least, have to be performing above average. That's not an assumption. That's just part of the definition of words. And also, the spelling bee is a word-based competition. That's just part of what the definition of a spelling bee is. So there's no assumption being made here to make this answer choice work. Excelling at the spelling bee does put you into the if part of this answer choice. And so based on that, we will know you will increase your chances at getting admitted to any college and any graduate program. And if you increase your chances at getting admitted to any college, well, that would include getting admitted into a selective college. So that's how this answer choice is going to make this conclusion valid. If you take performance-enhancing drugs, you'll excel at the spelling bee, and that's going to trigger the first half of A, which then means you will increase your chances at any college, which then means you increase your chances at a selective college. There you go. Now I should note that this answer choice, although it's sufficient to prove the conclusion, it is not necessary for the logic of this argument. And so in a different video, I made the point that there are many cases where the correct answer to a sufficient assumption question is also a necessary assumption, but this would be an example of one where it's only a sufficient assumption, but it is not necessary to the argument because it's too strong, it's too broad for the scope of what the argument actually needed. Now, I wanted to go into some more ways that the LSAT would make things more complicated in sufficient assumption questions, but I realized that the list would become too long. There are so many nuances to this beautiful test, and it would just take way too long to go into as much as I wanted to go into. So what I'll leave you with is just one more of the complications, one more of the ways the LSAT will make things more difficult, and that is contrapositives. Anytime in this video I said that would be a correct answer, or that would be the link that we're looking for, anytime I said that, the correct answer could also be the contrapositive of that idea, the contrapositive of that link. And so feel free to go back through the example arguments here and identify and articulate to yourself what that contrapositive would look like. So in a follow-up video, I will go into other complications, other nuances of sufficient assumption questions, as well as other related question types. But for now, I think I've left you with more than enough to digest.